How many of you would say you know a lot about George Henry Thomas? Well, we got some who say they do or don't. Good, because that means I can say whatever I want. You can't correct me. Well, you can, but then everybody else has got to keep silent. But I'm learning all the time about George Henry Thomas, but I like biography. It's the story of people. You want to understand what makes things tick. I really don't, I'm just going to say this blunt in front of you. I try to be honest. I don't care whether 9th Alabama stood for 3 minutes before it moved over here. I just don't care. And I'm sure it's important to some people that they'll want to know where that was. Some of us are Air Force people. We can't care about the Confederate Air Force. Well, there isn't much of one. I'll just say the Confederate drone system didn't work very well. Just saying that during the Civil War. But anyway, I'm all for anybody that does what they do, because that's what makes history tick, is that we can't all be the same. Imagine how boring that would be if we all knew the same stuff about the same things, and we sat around the room and patted each other on the back about how smart we are. Gordon said it really well. Every one of you knows more than I do, he does, or any of the rest of us about something you've studied, you've read, and that's what makes history interesting. I like people. And I like the story of people. I like to see what makes people tick. So I've written a lot of biography. Nathan Bedford Forrest you'll hear about tomorrow. I've got a lot of fun things to talk about for him tomorrow, so save some of your nasties for him, and we'll talk about him tomorrow. And I've written about Thomas. I've written about William Dorsey Pender, who was a North Carolinian, who is really fascinating. Thomas had an education. Dorsey Pender had an education. Both of them are West Pointers. Forrest did not. He had 6 months of formal education, so he did not. So he did not say much, he didn't write much, and what he did was connect. So when you're reading it, you have to almost say it out loud to understand what he's saying, because he would say it in the way he would have spoken. That would be pretty rudimentary at best. So Thomas was a writer. Pender was a big writer, and that's the one thing that made him easy to do, because he had tons of letters to read and to talk about, but he was young. He will not survive Gettysburg. He does survive the war. In fact, his only wound is a pre-war wound against the Indians of Native Americans in some of the fighting, just at the last of his service there before the Civil War sends him back east. But that's George Henry Thomas. This is a picture of my book about George Henry Thomas, and let's talk about the rock rolling for Atlanta. Just a few quick things. I promise not to spend too much time on this. He did very much come from a different setting or different background than a lot of his fellow comrades in blue. That's not to say all, because people like David Farragut and others were also Southern born. So there were Winfield Scott, Southern born. So there were others, but he was born in Southampton County. You can still go to the home place. It's privately owned, so please be nice, and just if you go there, knock on the door, they'll probably let you in. The room that he was born in has been remodeled. It's about half something, one thing, and half a restroom, a bathroom, a WC. So I don't know if that's a comment. My guess is it's not a comment. My guess is it's really more of a practical thing for the family that lives there, but I'm just saying. He did have a family here. His father will die when Thomas is a young man, and Thomas has to sort of become sort of an important figure in the family. He's there during the Nat Turner Revolt, and he actually takes his family into the local town. The local town is not what it is today. Today it's Cortland. Back at the time it was Jerusalem. Jerusalem would have been, if you go back to the maps and look at where it was then. So that's where he was born, but that's not where he's buried. We'll talk about that a little bit later. And he was born in 1816, so you don't have to memorize that. All right, his style of leadership and lessons that he's learned through his years, he will be in one of the Seminole conflicts. He'll then be in the Mexican-American War. And he'll be in various posts in the West. He actually is at various posts throughout the country, because he's actually in Charleston for a little while, for a brief period of time. He's in New York. He's all over the place. But he is of course known as Old Slow Trot, and a lot of the comments are about how slow he is. And Thomas seems to have been aware of that. A lot of people seem to think that he was very defensive oriented, so that he was really good in the defense, but not so good in aggressiveness. But that's not really true or not. Thomas will tell O. Howard, you've heard about him, we've talked about him, that at one point he said, I cannot leave my post because something is sure to get out of order if I go away from my command. It was always so, even when I commanded a post, and he's going all the way back to the Mexican-American War period. And he said, I had to stick by and attend to everything or else affairs went wrong. That attention to detail is just part of his personality. His attention to detail was very important. When Sherman turns to him as the leader of the largest army, that centerpiece, as Gordon has laid out very well for you, that's sort of being the one that's going to hold everything in place while various elements are going to test the flanks or whatever they might do. That little Bantam army, Army of the Ohio, will go off and try to find a flank to go around. It's Thomas who's also probably as prepared for almost everything. He goes into all kinds of logistical preparation, all kinds of things. He will have in his company street various officers' tents laid out in order so that he can go and talk with whatever and meet with whatever over whatever. And he's just about covered everything. And Sherman knew that. Sherman complained that Thomas's command was, his staff was too large, that his posts were too large, or whenever he seemed to be settled in, everything seemed to be more geared for comfort. That wasn't really the case. He slept largely on an army cot most of the time, not in some fancy home. Occasionally he had a little better service. We'll talk about why that may or may not have been the case. But he certainly from day one understood everything, even down to spying, getting intelligence gathering. How do you make sure you can maximize the information you get and then utilize that information? But one of the things he had learned is early on in one of his positions, he'd sort of been in charge of both the quartermaster element and the command of the post, and he had to go away from the post for a period of time. When he came back, everything was a mess. And to him, that's what taught him the lesson. You have to have your finger on the pulse. You have to be where you can make sure things are done the way you want them done. And he will do that at every point from then on with almost a rabid dedication. He's going to be focused on everything. When he goes to war, he's married his wife, Frances Kellogg. Both of them are older when they marry. One of the comments about her was that she is very much like the general, which I don't think is a compliment. I could be wrong, because apparently she was not unattractive. She just was, I guess, more stoutly built and maybe a little more serious, and maybe that's why it had been later in life that she married someone like George. She referred to him as the general. I mean, think about that. Later on she'll talk about the general this and the general that. In post-war writings, it's always the general. It's not George, it's not Georgie, it's not little G, it's not anything like that. It's always the general. But he will go off to war at the very beginning, and he will not see her for 3 years. He will literally not see her for 3 years. My wife and I are in separate locations. I have an apartment in Kennesaw. She has the farm in Virginia. Sometimes she comes to Kennesaw. Most of the time I go to Virginia. But it's about every other weekend, maybe every third weekend, and I feel like that's a pretty good little chunk. Now, I'll be honest with you, don't tell her I said this, and if this gets on camera, I'm going to deny every word. I do think absence makes the heart grow fond. When I'm away, I'm not sure, was I not supposed to look up on that? Was I supposed to pad my...
There's a blackmail letter coming in a minute.
Blackmail. Yeah. Well, she already's heard so much of this anyway, so really it's nothing that can't be used against me. But like I always say, she's a judge, so it was marry me or go to jail. She doesn't like it when I say that either, but that's all right. She'll get over it. She's got a sense of humor. After all, she didn't marry me, so she's got a sense of humor. Of course, I told her she was a cougar. I was just a young guy. She stole. But anyway, so back to my point. George Thomas didn't see his wife for all that period of time. So if I feel like I'm sort of on furlough in a military kind of marriage and whatnot, he really had one. He really did have one. He hadn't seen his wife for 3 years. In fact, he did not have an effusive sense of humor. He was not a fiddle player. You will not see that kind of thing from George Henry Thomas. But he had a quiet sense of humor, a dry sense of humor. One could almost say a British sense of humor. You could almost say that. More dry. I grew up watching Monty Python, so it's kind of, and then Peter Cook and people like that. I grew up with stuff like that. So anyway, I guess one of my favorite British humor things was where Peter Cook was talking about this fellow who went on from the mines to be a judge. And he said he was a young lad and he stumbled across the body of a dead pit pony and he went, "Oh!" And he said after that, every time he would go into the mines, he was not sure he might see it, and anytime something like that might happen. But then he went on to be a barrister, and he went on to the bench, and then he was sitting there in the court, and he said, just imagine that he has been found guilty of a most heinous crime, and I sentence him to, and he says, by British law, that would have to stand. So anyway, all right, so Thomas got one of his soldiers come up to him to ask for a furlough. And he says, I have not seen my wife for 3.5 years. My good man, do you think you deserve better than your general? And he says, well, me and my old woman ain't that kind. So maybe I'm like that. Me and my old woman ain't that kind. All right, so those are just a little bit of his personality. He will win brevets at Monterey and Buena Vista. He will win battle honors. He will win promotions. And he will have a sword given to him by his neighbors in Southampton County that is inscribed with all of these things on it. And the only thing he didn't like about that was he said, I'll have to give a speech when I come back to get the award, to get the honor. And he didn't like to give speeches. He was not a speech maker. In Kentucky, when he's raising troops, they're always saying, go out and give a speech. He says, what does a general want to have a speech for? What do you want to make a speech for? Just get your job done. And they said at the academy, whenever he was called on for recitations, his hand would shake like an aspen leaf. And so he just was very quiet kind of guy. He didn't think he should show off. So that was always one of his points. But at Buena Vista, what he will have is a chance to show his prowess in the field because he has a responsibility for one of the sections of the artillery, one tube, in this case, because it's only a one tube that he's responsible for at that battle, but he puts it where it needs to be and it does very effective work. And he plays that off a little bit later on his thing. He says, I saved my section of Bragg's battery at Buena Vista by being a little slow. So when everybody said he was slow, he said, well, sometimes it pays off. And he remembered when it paid off. Okay, which loyalty? Everybody knows Robert Edward Lee, right? Anybody not know Robert E. Lee? Okay, and there's George Thomas. They're both Virginians. They both picked different sides. One went with his Commonwealth of Virginia. One went with the Union. I did mention that I tell you another story about Thomas that may have contributed to some of his slowness. The slow trot thing, by the way, comes from his stint, not as a person in West Point himself, but as an instructor. He comes back in 1851 to be an instructor. And actually, part of that time, his superintendent is Robert E. Lee. Part of the time it wasn't, but part of the time it was. So he comes back, and that's where he met and ended up marrying, ultimately, in 1857, Frances Kellogg. The point I'm trying to make is that when he would come into training for artillery and cavalry, they did a lot of indoor riding. It had pillars. And he would say, gentlemen, slow trot. Because when they want to gallop like kids want to do, what if you run the horse into a column? This would not be good. And the government would not appreciate that. So he's always yelling at them to slow trot, and that's where slow trot seems to have come from. But it stuck with him, like all things, it kind of stuck with him. But this train, I've got a little reminder to sort of say that on the way back to Virginia at the outbreak of what will be hostilities, of the whole disintegration of the situation at the end of 1860 and then into 1861. He's on his way back from Texas. He actually also spent a lot of his time in Texas during court-martial duty with Robert E. Lee. In fact, at one point, Mrs. Thomas comes and lives with them. And Lee is more concerned about Mrs. Thomas than he is about himself or Major Thomas. He's not really worried about Colonel Lee and Major Thomas. He's worried about Mrs. Thomas. And I think that's another reason why, in some ways, they looked at the second time they were in those kinds of active circumstances very differently. She stayed in New York and he stayed in the field. Point is, he's on his way back, and we're not exactly sure when and how this happened, but the train stopped along the way at night to let the passengers stretch, I'm sure to get water, because that's another thing about these rail lines. They have to have stations along the way to keep the resources, especially water, resupplied. So that's another reason these things, and by the way, Augusta's here, and Macon is here, and Atlanta's here. So you can kind of, Macon's here, and Columbus is here. So you kind of see part of the reason Atlanta is important, because it's where you can bring all those places together and what's being produced in all those places together. But anyway, he gets off to stretch his legs, and it's a severe drop off, and he doesn't see it in the shadows of the dark. And he steps to take a walk, and he falls, and he wrenches his back. If you've ever hurt your back and your feet, everything's ruined. Because until you get well, you can't lie, you can't stand, you can't sit, you can't do anything. Because if your back hurts, everything hurts. And if your feet hurt, everything hurts. So I'm just saying, his back was in bad shape. And he was laid up. He did not know if he was actually going to be able to be up for active campaigning of any kind going forward, active service. So he actually was kind of looking at other positions, and one of his other positions was a potential instruction position, which he'd been an instructor at West Point, and he looked at a instructor position at Virginia Military Institute. Why not? It makes some sense. And at the end of the day, he didn't do that. At the end of the day, he got well enough that he was able to travel, but he never would have been on a horse called Slasher. I'm just going to say he would have never been on a horse called Slasher. And some people will make the comment that Thomas and his horse were very similarly matched. They were very comfortable, very slow, very methodical. And so that may have been the case. But anyway, Thomas will go with the Union. Of course, we know Robert E. Lee goes with the Confederacy. There will be a point at which Thomas has a chance to be advanced. He and Sherman had been together at West Point. They'd been roommates for a small period of time. They were known to each other. They were friends with each other. Yes, Sherman and Grant got along better than they did with Thomas, but none of them hated Thomas or thought less of Thomas. They respected him. He respected them. Any of the Thomas people that are real Thomas people almost automatically hate Grant. And any of the Grant people have questions about Thomas, but really, the truth is that they just waged war very differently. They approached things very differently. And that was the problem for the relationships they had. And I actually put that back to Chattanooga and Missionary Ridge era, that part of it, more than I do anything else. Some people say that their problem went back to Shiloh because Halleck favored putting Grant on the shelf after Shiloh and promoted Thomas. And then the idea is that somehow Thomas and Halleck and all this are linked together in a way that Grant will never forgive. I don't think that was the problem. To be honest with you, I don't think that was the problem. I think the problem was Grant was let's attack and then attack again and keep going. And Thomas was attack and then rehabilitate. Get yourself ready. And I think a lot of the ways he waged war was with the notion that if you undid something by being too aggressive, then you set yourself back even more, even in a worse shape. So I think that was it. But at one point, there was a question too about whether he was loyal. And supposedly Sherman, and you got to always be careful, memoirs are awful, because most of the time they're designed to sell books and rehabilitate reputations. And as Jack Davis once said about Sherman's account of marching through Georgia to the sea, he says prevaricating his way through Georgia, because he made up whatever he felt like making up. So Sherman will say at one point that he was looking at Thomas while Thomas was still in the Eastern Theater, which is only at the very beginning of the war. And he says, Thomas, are you heading south? He says, yes. Or he says, where are you going? He says, I'm heading south. And he said, oh my God, I vouched for you. I've said that you're a native Virginian, but you're loyal, you'll stick with the Union, and you're going south. He said, yes, but I'm going at the head of my troops. I'm going at the head of my troops. So Sherman didn't feel quite so unsure about that. And the whole thing about being crazy, we remember he says, I stood by you when you were crazy, and you stood by you, blah, 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 about being drunk and crazy. Grant couldn't hold his liquor. I don't think he drank all that much and that often, but when he drank, he couldn't. When I married my wife, it was beautiful because she could drink one drink, she was fine. Two, she was in trouble. So she became my designated driver because I can drink to my body weight. And I always thought I should be a heavyweight in the history department. I think I've accomplished that. But I had a professor once who, by the way, said I was the biggest waste of a beer drinking body he'd ever seen. I like bourbon. That's what I like. So anyway, the point is that Grant supposedly was drunk all the time. He really wasn't. But when he went on a bender, he didn't have to take much, and then he was really in bad shape. Sherman, at the beginning of the wars in Kentucky, he saw Confederates behind every tree. And he really did not do well. If the war had ended in 1861, we would have never heard of Grant or Sherman. And there would have been other people that would have been on the line to maybe be president or whatever the case may be, because it certainly wouldn't have been those two. And of course, Sherman never wanted to be all of that anyway. He told everybody he would turn down any nomination, etc., famously. But the point is that Sherman's earliest experience was pretty bad, but he grew in the job, and he grew particularly as he and Grant became closer, and Grant really did trust him. But again, Sherman in the field is not as effective as Thomas is in the field in many instances, because Thomas could attack and get the job done at Mill Springs. He basically disintegrates the Confederate Army. At Chickasaw Bluffs, Sherman gets his butt kicked. So, you can kind of think there's times where Sherman tactically in the field has setbacks, and yet because he's friends with Grant and got important relatives in important places. If you're John Sherman, you're up there in Washington, you can always take care of family members, and among others, by the way. What did Thomas have? Didn't have any congressional guardian. He didn't have anybody who could take care of him. He had a Virginia birth that people raised questions about. So, in the Tennessee campaign, the Kentucky campaign, when Bragg and Kirby Smith are supposed to move into Kentucky and liberate Kentucky and bring all these things, just like you're going to bring wagons of arms into Maryland if you're Robert E. Lee, and all these Marylanders are going to rise, and we'll distribute the guns. Now we'll have even larger armies than ever because they've just been waiting for us to show up. Well, the idea was Kentuckians had just been waiting for us to show up, so the same mentality. Problem is, of course, it didn't work out that way. And Don Carlos Buell, although he's caught sort of waiting to see how things will play out and not so well at the beginning, does get back together, and ultimately in the Battle of Perryville turns things around. But he's not made Lincoln and the administration very happy, and so they decide to relieve him of his command. And they tell Thomas, you can take over. We'll pick you to go in his place. And Thomas says, I'm not going to take command of a campaign that's in operation already with an army I didn't prepare. It's not my army. It's somebody else's army in a campaign I'm in the middle of and I didn't plan for. So he didn't like that. He stepped aside. Well, War Department Lincoln didn't care much for that attitude. He should have jumped in and taken his spot, and when he didn't, that left it open so that when Buell is relieved, it's William Stark Rosecrans who takes over, and they have to do a little manipulation of the paperwork to make that happen, but they make it happen. And Lincoln will say, let the Virginian wait for his chance later on. All right, at Mill Springs, as I mentioned, in 62, he defeats an army, so he shows aggressive capabilities. He shows that he can win a campaign, small level campaign, but a campaign nonetheless. And that's the one where the Confederate commander, Felix Zollicoffer, rides into the Union lines by accident. He's wearing a long linen raincoat so that they don't see his uniform, and he sounds like a general because he's giving orders. The orders are, don't fire, boys, you're shooting into your own men. Well, it is Yankees that he's telling to stop shooting at Confederates, but not on purpose. He does not, it's all a confused mass that I don't think anybody understood. And then he had an aide, and thank God Gordon doesn't have any aides like this. I don't have an aide anymore. I actually had an office administrator, but the dean took the position away and gave the money to somebody else. But Gordon has staff, and it's good he doesn't have staff like this, because the staff that was working for Zollicoffer, one of them wrote up and said, "General, those are the enemy," in that tone. Now, if you were riding by accident into the enemy lines and somebody realizes that and comes up to warn you, you'd think you'd have them come up and whisper. Let's turn around. This is not good. This is not good. Instead, he yells it, and then he pulls out his pistol and shoots the horse of the Union commander. The Union commander is a guy named Colonel Speed Fry from Lexington, Kentucky. You say, well, what difference does it make where he's from? People in Lexington before basketball loved horses more than anything else. He shot a Lexington, Kentucky guy's horse. So, of course, that made him perturbed. He got angry about that. Of course, he didn't appreciate being shot at himself either. So he shoots, they shoot back, he orders a volley, and Zollicoffer is killed. And part of the reason the Confederates lose that battle is that they're killed. But they've still got flintlock muskets in a rainy condition. You can imagine that when you're supposed to keep your powder dry, how that would work. And I do think those naked Southern Northerners coming up the river at Roswell in that area, coming across, scared the hell out of the Confederates. I think that's what it was. I don't think it was because they were intimidated by the Henry rifles. It may have been the other rifles. I don't know. But maybe not. Hard to say. And so at the end of the fight at Mill Spring, the Confederates retreat all the way to the river, Cumberland River, where they have a base camp that's fortified. And the Federals pursue them, and then Thomas does a Thomas. Thomas does a Thomas. He stops. And he says, I need to organize. And it was smart. You know, you're going to get officer casualties taken care of, soldier casualties taken care of, fresh ammunition. It makes sense to get your stuff together. And if you've got them trapped against a river that is swollen, rain swollen, there's no way they can get away. Except there was a little paddle wheel steamer, the single little paddle wheel steamer called the Noble Ellis, and it began to ferry the Confederates across the river, boatload by boatload through the night. The next morning, Thomas gets ready to attack, and there's nothing to attack. A handful of stragglers, a few people left behind because they didn't know what else to do. And then the rest are gone. Now, when they got to the other shore, they all split and went away. The army disintegrated. They went away. But I think the commander of that army was Crittenden, and it is the same Crittenden of the family of Senator Crittenden. The point I'm making about it, though, is it's little Dunkirk. They get away. They survive. The problem is that Thomas hasn't finished them off. That's January 1862. Anybody know what happens in February 1862? You're a Civil War people. Donelson. Who wins the reputation of Donelson? Ulysses Grant. Who was before the war Hiram Ulysses Grant? Hug. I don't think he'd have won much off Hug. It's good he changed it to U.S. Grant, Ulysses Simpson Grant. It's really an S. Point is, U.S. Grant, unconditional surrender Grant. But what if you're Thomas and you win the first unconditional surrender? It would have been interesting to see what you could have done with Grant, who didn't get the chance to be unconditional surrender because Thomas was there first. But Thomas missed his shot. I mean, they got away, and Thomas understood it. This is why I love George Thomas. Thomas had that same Speed Fry that shot at Zollicoffer and killed him. Same Speed Fry come up and say, Thomas, why didn't you just keep attacking them and finish them off during the night? And he said, hang it, Fry, I never once thought of it. I think that's the honest, tremendous honesty of the saying. His focus was on so many other obvious, legitimate kinds of concerns that his attempt to send his brain into let's just keep attacking, it just never happened. And, you know, I say at 9/11 or anything else, if we had thought they were going to do it and they could do it, we would have defended against it. But you can't imagine, whether it's a Pearl Harbor or 9/11 or October 7th, until it happens, it's hard to imagine it, especially if it's not in your idea that it's even possible that it could happen. So hang it, Fry's a tie to that moment where he's honest, but he's, missed his opportunity. Now, again, at Stones River, he's going to be excellent in defense. When the question is whether they should retreat after Braxton Bragg is attacked, Rosecrans is trying to figure out what to do. Thomas is kind of over in the corner sleeping a little bit because, I mean, like all these people, we forget they're people. They get tired, they get exhausted. And every now and then he'd rear up and say something because he was kind of listening but kind of dozing at the same time. And so he would say, there's no better place to die than here. This army can't retreat. And that became sort of his mantra too, is that, we'll hold the line because we really don't have any other choice but to hold the line. And he would excel at defense. He will excel at defense in a situation where even some of the future great figures are not as successful. Okay. His claim to fame, of course, is at Chickamauga, where he holds Snodgrass Hill and Horseshoe Ridge against repeated Confederate attacks. We won't go into all of that specifically today, but we will say that it's what earns him the nickname the Rock of Chickamauga. And the Rock of Chickamauga is how he will be known from then on. And not only did he do so well at Horseshoe Ridge and Snodgrass Hill to buy enough time to allow the Army as much as possible to retreat into better positions around Chattanooga. And by the way, there's a lot of places where the Confederates were probably going to get stymied no matter what, because they weren't going to just walk into Chattanooga following Rosecrans, even if Rosecrans retreated like he'd been hit on the head like a stunned duck, as one of the comments is made at the time. But there are places where even the most aggressive commander, like a Forrest, could not have probably penetrated and done much more than was possible anyway. Because it isn't like you have armies that just totally get obliterated. There are reserve forces, there are other elements that can rally. And even Forrest understood that a rallied opponent is as dangerous or more dangerous than one that's not. Because a rallied opponent may strike back at you when you're spread out and reverse what you've been able to accomplish. All right, so the Rock of Chickamauga is how Thomas is known. You don't really see him in a lot of art. That's probably the biggest piece of artwork, where he's holding the spyglass and he says the horse was so nervous he couldn't see, so he handed it back to a subordinate. Who is that coming? I can't make it out. And it turned out it was Gordon Granger and reinforcements, and they'd be able to hang on till the end of the day, and things were going to be all right. All right. It will ruin the army to withdraw it now. That's what he tells us as people are saying, let's retreat, let's get out of here. He says this position must be held until night. And again, I think it just reminds us of what his attitude had been at Stones River. At Stones River, that defensive mentality had worked for him there, and at Chickamauga it worked for him here. Okay. The president no longer waits. This is a response to one of the comments about relieving Rosecrans and relieving Thomas too. He says, I hate to state that in the state of information that we have here, nothing could be more ungracious to indulge a suspicion towards General Thomas. You should not harbor any more doubts about Thomas. It is doubtful whether his heroism or skill exhibited last Sunday afternoon at Chickamauga has ever been surpassed in the world. Imagine the President of the United States saying that. That's pretty high praise. So I said the President no longer waits, and that was in September 1863. Then, of course, the fighting comes around Chattanooga, where Thomas is in charge now of the Army of the Cumberland, while Grant makes his way over, and then ultimately Grant tries to get Thomas to push harder in trying to do something to lift the siege, and Thomas basically says, if you look at us, we've been cut from half rations down to quarter rations. We have animals dying in the streets. It's hard to even move artillery, much less put it into combat. We're in pretty rough shape. Although he had promised, when Grant told him, hang on to Chattanooga, we will hold the town until we starve. I love this. You're talking about learning PowerPoint. I love this. Now, everybody watch this. Very careful. Watch. Boom. Out goes Rosecrans. And in comes Grant. Isn't that good? Out goes Rosecrans. I bounced him right out. And I just love that. My students don't always appreciate that. Sometimes it wakens them up a little bit. It's good to do that. The ones that really like to sleep are on the back row. It's kind of fun to watch them, and you call them out and you say, well, how are things back there? And every now and then they'll wake up and say, well, we're fine. All right, Orchard Knob is Thomas's first big moment where he marches out and captures some ground out before Missionary Ridge. My good friend and your friend, all our friends, Jim Ogden, has been such a good instructor for me, because when we would go to Chattanooga, do Missionary Ridge, whatever, he would make it understandable to me in a way I had read about it and read about it and read. He made it understandable, and this is the easy explanation for it. You think of the Confederates up on the highest ground. You talk about a military crest on the highest ground, firing down on the people that are trying to cross in front of them. And usually you want to be, on the geographic crest. You want to be on the military crest, which is the forward-facing slope. You want to be on the military crest, which is a forward-facing slope. When you're on the highest ground, there are dead spots, the defilade that we talked about. The point is that the Confederates actually had earthworks along the base of the ridge, along the base. So the idea is not completely they sat on top of a ridge and waited for the Yankees to come. They actually had troops out on the base. Problem is, if they overrun those positions, and some of them were on Orchard Knob to start with, they were driven off. Then when the main attack comes against Missionary Ridge, they come against that forward trench line. Half the regiment is here, half the regiment's here. And I never understood, first of all, that the front lines are out away from the ridge, which meant that if you hold the ridge, you can fire into those trench lines. So once you take those lines, you can't stay there because you're under fire. So you either have to go back or you go forward. See what I'm saying? That's pretty important, because if you decide I don't want to go back, you might go forward. Well, who knows? Anyway, so you get in this line, you're vulnerable to fire. But then if you drive them off, they're retreating up the line toward their friends. They may hold fire or be more reluctant to fire as you advance, because they don't want you to hit the friends, and you can follow them. So that combination of things helps to explain why Missionary Ridge is successful. Now over here is a different tunnel hill, the two tunnel hills. One's in Georgia, one's here. The one over here in this area is defended largely by Pat Claiborne. And Pat Claiborne's tough. And the problem for Sherman is he didn't understand two things. He didn't understand the geography of Missionary Ridge. It had two ridge lines. He thought it had one. So he attacked the ridge he thought was Missionary Ridge. It was the one in front of Missionary Ridge. So he drove the Confederates off that, no problem. They weren't holding that anyway. But when he came on that second line, Pat Claiborne said, He said it in Irish. But he said, And it was They weren't going to come. So that's one reason Grant kind of then looks at Thomas and says, well, why don't you take some pressure off of Sherman, and why don't you attack against the middle? Hooker had done pretty good, some at Redemption. Hooker had done pretty good over on the other flank. And of course, he'd been involved in Lookout Mountain, which he, I understand, did buy paintings and did put himself on the white horse in the middle. But you can talk about that later. I don't want to take anything away. There's Lookout Mountain. The point is that, and also one of the rare night fights was Wauhatchie over here, where the Federals had first crossed to open up, quote unquote, the cracker line to get supplies into Chattanooga. Point is that when the Confederates are retreating and the Federals follow, the soldiers of the Army of the Cumberland can redeem Chickamauga. And they were yelling, Chickamauga, Chickamauga, to the Confederates as they retreated, as they drove them off the line at Missionary Ridge. I won't talk about the Grant-Thomas relationship here unless you ask about it, so if you want to know more, you can. Okay, here, I'm not going to repeat all of this because this is kind of what Gordon was saying. I just like that one picture because to me, Sherman looks like he's a child molester there, doesn't he? Doesn't he look unsavory? I think he looks unsavory. And of course, there's McPherson, and they say that there was no fear in McPherson. That's what was said, McPherson. But anyway, and there's George Thomas. Well, of course, Grant was not in the Western Theater, but Grant by this point had been promoted to a lieutenant general and is in real good shape, in charge of all the armies in the field. And his man is Thomas, and McPherson is really his man. And then Thomas and Schofield are there as well. So I do not like Schofield. How many fans of Schofield do we have here? Anybody? Thank God you did not raise your hand. If you think Hood was backstabbing Johnston, Schofield was constantly backstabbing Thomas. And at one point, one of Thomas's staff people, one of his actually subordinate generals said, "Do you recognize the signature on this document?" And he says, "Yeah, that's Schofield." He says, "Does that tell you anything?" Thomas didn't even dream a fellow officer would be sending negative messages, undercutting messages that would advance himself at the expense of his comrade to someone else, because Thomas would never have done that, never dreamed of doing that, never thought of doing that. Schofield not only dreamed it, thought it, he did it. Okay, so I'm not a big Schofield fan. Okay, the center, the main column of direction, we're getting talking about kind of what Gordon has said will be the Army of the Cumberland, the biggest of the three. And this is what I was telling you about earlier. General Thomas's army, this is Sherman, was the largest of the three, the best provided for. Now he would say, I provided for it, but he really has got to say Thomas provided for it. Thomas took care of it. Contained the best corps of engineers, railroad managers, repair parties, as well as the best body of spies and provost marshals. So that's Thomas at his best, his organization, but he also could be aggressive. In fact, wait till you see the comment that Howard will make. Okay. I was at, oh, I'm sorry, I hope I didn't hurt you when I did that. Yeah, so he's got his hearing aid thing and I just beat it. So sorry about that, but you woke up, didn't you? The Indians had attacked. Okay, all right. Here's Sherman, he's dressed a little better there. He's let children alone, so he's okay. But here's a Union artillery piece led by a 6-horse team. And at Petersburg, we actually were a Confederate artillery team, but we had 6 horses, so we were very lucky. They had 6 horses. So there's the lead pair, the swing pair, and the wheel pair. And the lead pair just goes and takes you wherever you're supposed to go. The swing pair says, where's that tail going? I'm going to go with it, right? But the wheel pair are very important. The wheel pair have the only brakes. It's not like a wagon or anything that's a conveyance, a stagecoach I was trying to think of, which you know what I'm saying. Because there's no brakes on the limber at all. It's an ammunition chest on wheels. And the brakes are all those straps you put on, and when the horse slows down, that big butt, it pushes against him and it slows the whole mechanism down. So that's what does it. And Sherman says of Thomas, he's my off-wheel horse. He's clearly saying he's one of the 2 most important horses I've got in my team. He's the team. But he's the off-wheel horse. What does that mean? He isn't ridden. He's not ridden. See, the guy's riding on the on wheel. This is the off wheel. So it's the most important horse of the team of horses, but it's the one that's not being ridden. He knows how to pull with me. He knows how to do what I need for him to do in one sense. But he don't pull in the same way. And that gets back to that aggressive versus less aggressive mentality. I think the beautiful thing about the Army of the Tennessee, the Army of the Cumberland, the Army of the Ohio, that combination, that Army group, was this blending of personalities. Because if you'd had the same person in each place, it would have been potentially disastrous. Instead, you've got sort of that steady man in the Army, that's the biggest army in the middle, and those more flashy generals on either side, okay? Throughout the campaign, Thomas would look at the campaign and what can go wrong? What could go wrong? But he never stopped. That's the difference. He didn't stop. Now, Joe Johnston might have said, what can go wrong? I'm going to stop. Or I'm going to retreat. Instead, Thomas would say, I'm going to assess. Thomas was kind of a scientific kind of thing. And Schofield said he was not very bright. Because that was Schofield. But Schofield was missing the fact that so often Thomas was assessing. He was using, do you know he gave scientific, he did all kinds of scientific experiments when he was out west. He actually sent different types of things to the Smithsonian so that they would have some record of these animal species. Well, that's pretty interesting. I don't know, that's different than I ever thought of George. I never knew that about George Thomas. That's the good thing about biography. You learn about these people. All right, throughout the campaign, Thomas will see risk, though he still mostly looks at it in terms of assessment, where Sherman sees opportunity. How can I take advantage of this situation? All right, Thomas will move. This is Sherman. I want everybody to see this. I don't know what that time is, I don't care. It's 12:03. Am I doing too wrong?
A little bit.
A little bit. Okay, I'm gonna go fast. Okay, Thomas moved straight against Joe Johnston, wherever he may be, fighting him cautiously. Fighting him cautiously. Who's saying this? Sherman to Thomas. Fighting him cautiously, persistently, to the best advantage. All right, here's the red clay minuet. Here's the Army of the Cumberland. Thomas, as you know, is slow but true as steel. That's Sherman telling that to Grant. Grant knew Thomas. Sherman complains. If the Army of the Cumberland sees a fresh furrowed field, they'd stop to entrench. He's just being sarcastic. He wants him to go no matter what. Okay? And this is O.O. Howard, one of my favorite comments. Thomas could move quickly enough when duty demanded it. When duty demanded it, he could go. All right, here's a map drawn by Ed Bars, our dear friend Ed Bars, that talks about some of these lines. And again, the weather has a factor in all this. You can't just go oblivious to the weather and to other conditions. Not only the defenses and the natural obstacles, but the weather itself. Okay, so back to my last big point before we move into Kennesaw, which you talked about a little bit, and we'll just say a few things about. Thomas is constantly sort of pushing forward, but he's that centerpiece that frequently is left the maneuver to other armies. And if you notice that in that map at Kingston, it's Thomas that moves down to secure the railroad, and it's the other armies that move out on the road system that makes them vulnerable to an attack. Okay, our flanking movements are ended. This is what Sherman tells David Stanley before Kennesaw. Nothing comes of them. Well, of course something had come of them. The entire campaign had come of them. The entire campaign had worked. Now we've got to attack the enemy in front wherever we find them. At Pickett's Mill, you ever hear about it? New Hope, Dallas, they did have attacks. They did have fights. Now, the Confederates didn't do so well at Dallas. They did all right at New Hope and the other. Gentlemen, I'm sorry this assault has been decided on. I know it will fail. You talk about a team player, I don't think you're going to get a bigger team player than George Thomas, because he's going to say, we've got our job, our duty. We have to attack. I fear it may be so, but General Sherman has decided it. We must do our best. If we possibly succeed, it will be a great victory. Sherman knows that Grant is bogged down in Virginia, while the American Confederate defenses of Virginia are holding on. By the way, Grant's maneuvering too. I think we forget that Grant's maneuvering, including had he reached Spotsylvania only 2 hours earlier, he'd have beat Grant, he'd beat Lee there. He's going to come across the James River. Lee doesn't even know he's done it. Pretty impressive stuff. Okay, but what Sherman understands, if I can punch my way through, and he thinks at Kennesaw, Johnson spread too thin, if I can punch my way through, I end the campaign. What if I end the campaign and Grant's still bogged down? Won't that be fun? Won't that look good for me? Won't that look good? Do you not think they had competitive spirit? These people have egos. If I can show my boss I can do it better than he can, that ain't a bad thing. Okay, here's the attacks. And by the way, Logan didn't do so well at Pigeon Hill, and I'm just saying, I know he's the MVP. I get all that. He can play a fiddle. Okay. All right, here's the attack against the salient. I say salient because I'm Southern. I can't help it. Charlie Harker and Dan McCook try to smash their way through. And Ben Frank Cheatham, and there's Pat Claiborne on the end of that line. There's no artillery here. The artillery's here, and the artillery's over there. This is mostly going to be a rifle fire. Rifle fire that does the job. Some firing of artillery along the flanks that causes some damage as well. From what the officers tell me, I do not think we can carry these works by assault at this point today. Thomas informed Sherman. He keeps him informed, and ultimately that's the field, at least as it looks today. It was wider and more open back then, and Thomas is basically trying to convey that we are up against a very formidable position. The reason they were put there, by the way, was the engineers came in at night. They didn't know they weren't on the military crest, because if they had, they would have put it out in the front a little bit more. All right, again, we won't get too much. I love this guy. Once he gets in his mindset, there's no changing, bashing his head against the wall. And that kind of might be what Sherman's doing. Because at the end of the day, what really was working was the flanking that he'd always been doing. But Thomas will tell him the enemy's well defended. And Sherman will say, everywhere we go, he'll be well defended. We need to attack anyway. To the Marietta and across the Chattahoochee, we'll have a chance to hear more about that, so I'll leave that to Gordon as he's talking about that. Thomas's other big battle will be the Battle of Peachtree Creek. And again, it's Sherman who directs both Schofield and Thomas to bring in the artillery to shell Atlanta into submission, and tells Grant that besieging Atlanta is like the great city of Troy of ancient days, and Atlanta is more valuable town than Troy. And then finally, there's a couple of Trojans that are Greeks that end up making it into the movies, in case you can't tell who they are. Atlanta will fall, and together Sherman and Thomas made a very formidable combination leading the Western Yankees. That's my friend Rich and our friend Richard McMurray who said that. And I think he's right. I put the eagle up there so that you'd see they won. And of course, if you want books. I'm going to stop with that, but also we'll leave the books so that you can see them. Charlton Heston. Somebody says, well, why did you write about Charlton Heston? I love the Civil War in the movies. I wrote a book about Gone with the Glory, the history of the Civil War in the movies, and I really love the movies, and I love Charlton Heston. I love those epics. I love epics. So I wrote that. Inglorious Passages is the one where the non-combat mortality, it's all the ways you could die in the war and not be killed by enemy fire, and you'd be amazed all the ways. But my favorite story is the fellow that's walking along with an open cask of powder with a cigar, lighted cigar. And the diarist says he blew his head off. Those mortar men are said to be careless. So I'll stop with that. Thank you, Mike.